Now, the first key question is how successful were the religious thinkers in spreading Islam during the 18th and the 19th century? 18th century is the years from 1700s till 1799, and this would be again 1800 to 1899. So we are going to talk about these two time periods and what were the religious thinkers doing and how successful were they in spreading Islam, which is also known as the revival of Islam. Because when you get a question regarding the religious thinkers, you can be talking about revival of Islam, you can be talking about the spread of Islam. So this is the key idea in key question number one, that how Islam revived, spread across India. The three people that we will be focusing on is the reforms that were given by Shah Waliullah. He was a theologist who gave the ideas of reforms. Then Haji Shariatullah, he introduced a Faraizi movement, which was inspired again by Shah Waliullah. And then the influence of Sayyid Ahmad Barelvi, who talked about the jihad movement, which was again inspired by Shah Waliullah's reforms that he had talked about and also advocated over his time period. Now, before we go on about these reformers, we need to understand why was the need to reform and why was the need to bring about all these changes, and why are we constantly talking about a revival of Islam in India. The condition of India at large at that time was that during the times of Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb, who ruled for almost around 50 years, if we round that up, he died in 1707, and by this time the deterioration of the Muslims, not only politically but also their living conditions, had started to go down to a great extent. After Aurangzeb's death, the Mughal Empire was handed over to successors who were considered to be incompetent. That means they were not well versed in forms of administration. They were not well termed in how to run a large empire, because during the times of Aurangzeb, the extent of this Mughal rule had grown immensely. There was a lot of chaos, un-Islamic practices were being followed, and the reformers, the three reformers that we will be talking about in this particular key question, that they were making attempts to revive Islam, because there were a lot of un-Islamic practices had sort of intuned into the regular living practices of the Muslims, and then there was instability that was coming into the Muslim rule in India because of, again, incompetent and weak successors. And there was a line of weak successors you would come across when you're reading about the decline of the Mughal Empire. There was a huge set of people. There were six major Mughal emperors, and then there was a huge line that till 1857. Now, in particular, what was happening to the Muslims in particular, because that is why the Muslim revival is being talked about in this key question. We are talking about what was the influence of these reformers. We will be talking about their works in this. These are key questions that you should keep in mind. That you should be writing these down as well. That the influence of the Muslim rulers, then we are talking about what they were doing for the revival and what were their contributions. These are the repetitive questions, as we talked about earlier in the slide. Also, these are the ones that keep coming, and then you have to, and we need to understand the conditions of Muslims, the condition of India, so we are able to attempt all the questions that we will be talking about in particular regarding the key religious thinkers. So there was a lot of foreign influence that was coming in, and this foreign influence is the East India Company, that is the British East India Company in particular, then the puppet government, which is also known as a titular government, It's a better name. We should learn this. And there was no understanding of Islam as per proper meaning and spirit. There was a lot of other influences that were merging in, and the true essence of Islam was seeming to be lost. There was the division started, which is the nobility versus the common man. So it was more of an economic division that was prevalent and could be seen very prominently. And then the idea of Khilafat, that is the leadership, was being lost. That Islam is dependent on the idea of Khilafat, leadership, and that was being lost during this particular period of time. And again, the reason will be given to the foreign influences, not understanding, as well as the division. Sectarian conflict started to grow to a great extent during the times of Aurangzeb. That means there was a division within the Muslims, that is Sunni versus the Shia. Again, this is some of the policies that were introduced by Aurangzeb that sort of enhanced this sectarian conflicts. Then we are talking about the economic aspects, that is, a lot of extensive taxes were being collected, and the merchants were being exploited by the East India Company, the farmers, worker, and there was a heavy taxation that was affecting the economic conditions of the Muslims. When economy is disturbed, so is the social life of a place is also disturbed. So when the economy goes down, so does the social life, and the social interactions of the people start to disintegrate as well. We will take a little break here and then we'll carry on. Okay, we begin with the reforms of Shah Waliullah because he lays the basis, or you can say the foundation of the further reformers and the revivalists that come. So before we go on, just a little introduction about the idea of reforms, which is also known as the revival. Most of the questions talk about the revival and they talk about the spread. So reforms are various kinds of changes for the improvement. So as we have already talked about the conditions of India, and we've talked about the conditions of Muslims during the 18th and the 19th century. Now the idea of talking about reforms becomes relevant, that why it was needed, why the change was needed, and why the improvements were the need of that time. Now, Shah Waliullah, he was a very pious and prominent Muslim supporter during the times of the 18th century. He was born in 1704, almost 3 years before the death of Aurangzeb Alamgir. He got his name as Shah Waliullah because of his piety and because of his great knowledge in Islam. He was one of the first few people, or we can say he was the pioneer in this movement of revivalism or reforms. He talked about the corrupt Mughal government. He was able to point out to all the malpractices. He was able to tell and introduce people to the idea that they need to come out of their current situation, and that is why he introduced the different kinds of reforms which were in these fields of religion, economy, politics, as well as society and social. And this one, the Marathas, the war with Marathas, also gets credit to Shah Waliullah. Not that he fought the war, but he had invited Muslim rulers from Persia to help the Muslim rulers at that time to bring down the Maratha influence and the growth of the Maratha power. A little about Shah Waliullah, that he, as we just said, he was born in 1703. He was named Qutbuddin Ahmad ibn Abdul Rahim and got his name as Shah Waliullah. His father was a religious scholar. He was a jurist. That means he had great knowledge in Islamic laws, and that is why he was also part of the people who compiled the Fatwa-e-Alamgiri, which is the first book of law in subcontinent. And then this part, Madrasa-e-Rahimiyya, which you can often get a source question about the importance of Madrasa-e-Rahimiyya in the revival of Islam, the contributions of Madrasa-e-Rahimiyya in the revival of Islam, the prominent scholars who were part of Madrasa Rahimiyya. These are little source questions that you can get, which is usually 4 to 5 marks question, the source question. So you can keep getting, you should be able to understand the importance of Madrasa Rahimiyya. As we know that his father had set up Madrasa Rahimiyya in Delhi, and so was Shah Wali Ullah not only a student there, he also taught there after his father's death. And at early childhood, having a spectacular memory, he was able to understand, learn Quran, Hadith and Tafsir. Now remember, Tafsir is the understanding of the Quran, which comes through Hadith as well as Quran itself. He, as you can see, it says that he studied Arabic and Persian grammar and literature. So that is one of the reasons he has a better understanding of these two concepts as well. Being a theologist, he was able to give out more information, he was able to introduce, he was able to explain the various reforms that he had introduced. Now, this time period when he goes for the pilgrimage is the one that brings him to talk about the reforms when he goes back to India. He had spent almost 8 years in Arabia with his teacher, who was Abu Tahir bin Ibrahim, and his teachings, his influence made him to think that when he goes back to India, he needs to introduce certain changes, he needs to introduce certain reforms that will help the Muslims of India to revive, because this is the key question that we are constantly talking about, is that how important was the revival of Islam, what was the idea of the revival of Islam, and then the key question, that is the chapter 1, that how successful were these all reformers and thinkers in spreading Islam in the subcontinent during 18th and 19th century. And this goes again, all credit goes to Shah Waliullah's time spent in Arabia, that he was able to better understand Islam. He was able to understand how the workings, how the leadership, how the ideology should be transferred and transmitted to the people, so they can understand what their religion is telling them. So we are going to talk about why did he, that is Shah Waliullah, wish to revive Islam in the subcontinent. This, if is only if asked about why, can be a 7 marks question, and if it is adds a word which says explain, can become a 14 marks question as well. So I would want you to refer back to the previous slides, that is the condition of Islam in the subcontinent and conditions of Muslims in subcontinent. That is where you will be able to make a link to this particular question. So Shah Waliullah believed that because after his return from Arabia, he was able to talk about that the people were not well versed with the language, Arabic language, so they were not able to understand the Quran very well, and the only language that was slightly common to them was Persian. So he wanted to make it more accessible to the people. So he thought that one of the things that is lacking is the understanding of Quran because of the language. Then he talked about that the Muslims were being divided into different sects. The sectarianism had started to grow, as we again talked in the previous slide. That is the division between the Hindu Muslims within the Muslims. And then he talks about the un-Islamic practices that had become part of the Muslim values. So coming down to the 7 marks questions, you have these 3 major reasons given, and if you're talking, and when you talk about these 3 major reasons, you're able to attempt a 7 marks question and we're talking about their causes and effects. And when you come down to the explain question, you further elaborate each of these points will become an answer to your 14 marks question, giving a cause, effect and interpreting what you have written. So why did he wish to revive Islam in subcontinent? Because of his people did not have proper knowledge in Islam. They were divided and there were a lot of un-Islamic practices that had become part of the Muslim daily life, and that needed to improve and change. That would bring about the revival, that will bring about the change and help the better spread of Islam, better Islam. Okay.